Hello everybody, welcome to our lesson number 20 for confirmation class, our lesson on the sacrament of the altar. Now remember that in these last 6 weeks of the confirmation curriculum, what we're doing is we are going back through all of the stories, all of the information that we've already known, looking at the themes that we've already talked about, the teaching moments that we've already had, and we're putting it back together. The first time when we look through it as part of the story of the Bible. The second time that we are looking through it today, especially for the sacrament of the altar, but in general in these last 6 weeks, what we're doing is we are putting it back together by means of the catechism. And so today we're looking at the sacrament of the altar, aka the Lord's Supper. Yeah. And so you have a question at the beginning of your sheet, the lecture sheet for today. Why is this night different from all other nights? And that's the question that would begin the celebration of the Passover in Jewish families. The Passover was a remembrance of the Exodus story, and with those words, the youngest member of a family would kick off this night that was different from all other nights. And so, the Lord's Supper is situated within the Passover, which means for us that we're going to go back to Exodus 12 to remember what happened there. Passover, what do I mean by that, right? The Passover in Exodus 12 happens before the last and greatest of plagues on the Egyptians. You should write those words down. The last greatest plague on the Egyptians, you remember that's the killing of the firstborn. But for the Hebrews, God gave them a meal of remembrance. Instead of their firstborn getting killed, they were to have this meal of remembrance, and by that meal, the angel of death was going to pass over them. They were to spread the blood of an unblemished lamb on their doorposts, and that would save them. Now the question is, what does unblemished mean? Unblemished means that it doesn't have any spots, it doesn't have any bad parts to it, but instead it is a lamb that's perfect in every way. An unblemished lamb on their doorposts, and that would save them. This freed them from slavery to the Egyptians. Also, God told the children of Israel to keep on eating that. Where am I? Oh, I'm up there. Keep on eating that meal every single year. So the first year, it actually had the angel of death pass over them by the blood that was upon their doorposts as they ate the unblemished lamb in celebration of this meal. Every other time that they ate that, it was remembering what God had done for them. This meal was supposed to remind them of God's power to save, even when they were enslaved, not just by Egypt, but by those two big empires that we've learned about in Isaiah's day, Assyria and Babylon. That's those two, Assyria and Babylon. And then enslaved ultimately, like we are as well, ultimately to death. And this is all very important because it is during the Passover that Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper in Luke chapter 22. Remember in that lesson, I believe that it was lesson 8 or 9, Exodus and Christ. We talked about this before. We compared the Passover and the Lord's Supper. And we found that the Passover, it looks to the final enemy, which is the devil and death. It looks to the final enslavement, the final enemy of death. In the past, we remember that Christ saved the new Israel, which is the church. That's you and me, right? So whenever Revelation, talks about Israel, we're talking about the new Israel, which is the church, everybody who believes and is baptized. In the present, we live in this new exodus from slavery to death. That is to say, you and I are liberated from our fear of death. And death for us has become not so much a wall that we hit, but instead a doorway to pass through to life eternal by the promises of Jesus Christ. And there's also a future aspect to it as well. In the future, we await Christ's return, the fulfillment of recreation. Remember, hearkening all the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and 3, there is a creation. And then in the Lord's Supper, we're looking and pining after a recreation and the culmination of our freedom. In the Lord's Supper, we see the sacrifice of the Lamb of God. Knowing the Passover story helps us to better understand that the Lord's Supper is a meal that enacts the salvation our God brings. Now, long ago, I had you star that last statement because this is really key right here. Knowing the Passover story helps us understand that the Lord's Supper doesn't just symbolize what God has done for us. It actually enacts God's salvation. It does more than just symbolize or remind us. It enacts what God has done for us. If you haven't already put that kind of a phrase into your faith essay, I'd invite you to put that phrase in. All right, so that is what we're talking about today, how the Lord's Supper does what it does by the promises of God in a way that is like the way God has worked before in the Passover, and in a way that looks back toward the way that God created everything and looks forward toward the way that God will create everything on the last day. All right, so once you have all of that down, I would invite you to turn to the build section. And we have a pop quiz at the top there. When you take the Lord's Supper, are you eating bread and wine? Well, the answer is yes. How do you know? Because Jesus calls it bread and wine. When you take the Lord's Supper, are you eating body and blood? And the answer is yes. And the answer to how do you know is, well, Jesus calls it body and blood. Does this make sense? Why or why not? And I'm going to invite you to think about whether or not that makes sense, because it is a matter of faith. It's a matter of belief. And so, for one who believes that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, it does make sense since it flows out from Him. If one believes that Jesus is Lord and Savior, we also realize that our beliefs don't necessarily make sense the way that the world would have us make sense. Do we know, is it 50% flesh and 50% bread in that little wafer that you take? Well, Jesus doesn't talk that way. What Jesus says is that it is both body and bread, both wine and blood, and when we receive it for the forgiveness of sins. And so, next question, what makes you worthy to take the Lord's Supper? I'd invite you at this time to go to your catechism and go to the Lord's Supper section of your catechism. Right in the first 30 pages or so of the catechism, there's a Lord's Supper section, and it talks exactly about this. What makes you worthy to receive the Lord's Supper? You see, the answer there is that what makes you worthy to take the Lord's Supper is knowing that you are unworthy. Knowing that you are in need, knowing that you are sinful and that you can't do it on your own, and that the only way that the Christian can ever get through life is by leaning on the strength of our God. All right, how do we describe the relationship of the bread, wine, body, and blood? 3 words that we use in Lutheran lingo, 3 words that if you haven't written your faith essay yet, I'd invite you to put them in. They are in, with, and under. In, with, and under. That's kind of how we talk about the Lord's Supper. In, with, and under. That the body and blood are in, with, and under the bread and wine. What does that mean? Well, it means that we know by faith that it is body and bread, blood and wine. But how it exactly stacks up, the Lord never revealed to us. And so we're going to believe what He says, even if we don't know how it exactly works. After that, I'd invite you to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. That's in the New Testament, Paul's first letter to the people of Corinth, called Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And answer these questions. Why is it called the New Covenant? What are the Old Covenants? Right? He is renewing the old covenants, 3 of them that we talked about previously. I'd invite you to remember that and then answer those questions. What were people doing in Corinth at the time? The people in Corinth were treating the Lord's Supper like any other meal. They were treating the Lord's Supper like any other meal. They were saying, we can drink and eat how much we want. We don't have to wait for anybody else to be here. And when the wine and the bread are gone, we can just tell people who got there late, sorry. Well, what Paul is doing in 1 Corinthians 11 is he's saying, guys, this is not like any other meal. This is something special. This is something different. So, last question on that page. Summarize Pastor Muther or Pastor Griffin's testimony about the Lord's Supper by answering this question. What does Pastor think is so great about the Lord's Supper? And I can tell you a couple things. One story about myself and one story about a lady in our congregation. And then I'll also tell you how I prepare for the Lord's Supper. So, I prepare for the Lord's Supper by praying. By praying the prayers that are in your Lutheran service book. That's that burgundy book that we have in the pews. I look on the front cover, right on the inside front cover, and I pray those prayers for myself. When I receive the Lord's Supper, I go back to my, if I ever have the privilege of worshiping rather than leading worship, I go back to my seat right next to my wife. I hold my wife's hand and I pray silently to myself that the Lord would, through the Lord's Supper, make me a better pastor, a better father, and a better husband. Because, well, I can always be a better pastor, a better father, and better husband. All of my days I can improve. I would invite you to know that what I think is so great about the Lord's Supper is that it gives us strength beyond our own. It gives us peace that passes understanding. Now that's really key for me, because I have realized very often in this life that I am not enough for my kids, I'm not enough for my wife, I'm not enough of a pastor for the people here. I need to rely on the strength of somebody else. If I were relying on my own strength to do everything that needed to be done, I would find that I fell down pretty easily, pretty quickly, and I fail pretty often. But praise be to God that I don't rely on my own strength. I don't have to worry about whether I can do it or not. I rely on the strength of my God. I say, Lord, you know everything that's going on. You know what I can do and you know what I can't do. Lord, I pray that you would be leading and caring for your people through me and through a multitude of others, because I can't do it on my own. That's often what I pray for you. I know that I'm not enough to lead you in your faith. You need to be surrounded as confirmants by a cloud of witnesses all around you that teach you your Christian faith in all sorts of ways. And so, what does Pastor think is so great about the Lord's Supper? Well, it gives us strength that is beyond our own. It gives us peace that passes our own understanding. I want to tell you a story about a gal. Her name is Cindy. I remember she was having the kind of surgery that you never really want to have. It was the kind of surgery where they were dealing with her back, which is a terrible thing to deal with anyways, but they had to go in from the front. So, in order to fuse her spine, they needed to make an incision on her abdomen. They needed to open her up. They needed to scoop out all of her organs, put them over here, keep them going while they fused her spine from the front. And I remember her calling me up right before that surgery and asking me, Pastor, can you come on by and give me communion? And of course I said yes. So I went on by her house and we talked, and then we had communion. And then, as I often find, especially with individual communions, after you have communion and say the blessing, there's just this little bit of silence that's right there, where it doesn't even feel like anything is worthy to be spoken for a little while. You just want to revel in what you have just received. And I remember she broke that silence after 15 seconds or 30 seconds or so, and she said, Pastor, I remember this. Pastor, don't get me wrong. You're an okay preacher. But receiving the Lord's Supper is something that is meaningful to me in a way that I can't express. Every time I receive it, it means more. And I think about that almost every time that I go up to the Lord's Supper, that every time that you take it, it gives you exactly what it gave you the first time, which is the forgiveness of sins, life eternal, and salvation. But it also does something more. Every time that you take it, you are reminded of that again. You are receiving it again. You are remembering again all that God has done for you and receiving all those benefits. And so it gets more and more powerful and significant to know that every time that you take the Lord's Supper, you are taking it with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. Now notice those words, all the company of heaven. What that means is when it's talking about the company of heaven, it's talking about all those saints that have gone on before you in the faith. All your grandpas and grandmas who have passed away, all those who have died in their faith. I think about this last year, my grandma passed away just over a year ago now. My grandpa passed away a year and 4 months ago. And every time that I take the Lord's Supper, I am taking it with them as they are at the side of Jesus Christ in heaven, eating that feast with me as a foretaste of the feast to come at the end of all time. All right. One last little bit here on the took section. I'd invite you to look at this took section as well. Practice what you will do around the Lord's Supper. Now, we're going to have to do that at some point as a confirmation class, and I don't really know when that is going to be. But practice what you will do around the Lord's Supper. Think about in your own mind how you are going to prepare for the Lord's Supper, what questions you might ask yourself. There are questions, by the way, in the confirmation catechism for you there, for you to examine yourself in preparation for the Lord's Supper. Write out what you want to do after the Lord's Supper. Are you going to pray a prayer like the prayer that I pray, that the Lord would make me a better husband, a better father, and a better pastor? So take some time and think about that and write down your answers. Second, look in the Lutheran service book, in your catechism or in your notes. Write out the prayer that you would pray after you come back from the Lord's Supper as well. I kind of said that in the first part, but I didn't look far enough down my sheet to know that I needed to say it now. So think about the way that you're going to act after you receive the Lord's Supper. Are you going to pray a certain prayer? Are you going to make sure to do a certain thing that helps to remind you of what you have received bodily in the body and blood, bread and wine of the Lord's Supper? How are you going to use, remember, and find meaning in the sacrament that gives you forgiveness of sins, life, and salvation? All right, that's lesson 20 on the sacrament of the altar. We'll see you next time.